What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, it's Monday, you know what time it is. It's time to go over those top waiver ads as we head into week 12. The playoffs, they're right around the corner, and I will say this week we do have some strengths in some categories we typically hadn't. Running back is definitely the highlight this week. There's some good value at wide receiver. Ownership percentages, they are a bit high, so not everyone will be available for all of you out there, but we definitely have some really solid names for you. If you are wondering exactly how much fab or what priority we would spend on each player, don't hesitate to check our website. That has all of our waiver information updated on there throughout the week. Members of our website not only gain access to that waiver info, you'll also have access to the rankings, our trade model, sports betting picks, DFS picks, and more. So if that interests you, you can hop over to our website. That's thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Link for that in the description box below. With that being said though, let's hop over to the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was which tight end currently leads the league in yards per reception. The correct answer was actually Mike Gesicki. Congratulations to Eton the Beast 92. You got this one right. As for today's stat of the day, which wide receiver currently leads the league in targets inside of the end zone? Once again, that's which wide receiver currently leads the league in targets inside of the end zone. Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. Without further ado, guys, let's get right into the running backs. This section is definitely what I would consider the highlight. Yes, there are a lot of running backs that are owned in that 20 to 40% mark, but each player on this list, you'll notice that if you do grab any of these running backs off the waivers, you could possibly start them as early as this week. The leader and the leader last week has been Wayne Gallman. Gallman, as we know, has been taking over for the injured Devonta Freeman. Freeman, of course, still on IR, but the most important factor to consider is that Wayne Gallman has been much more efficient in this role. Gallman has been able to average 4 rushing yards per carry. Devonta Freeman in this same role, 3.2, and hasn't averaged 4 yards per carry himself since 2018. This does leave open the possibility of Wayne Gallman being the workhorse running back, even with Devonta Freeman returning, but at the very least, we know they won't rush Freeman back, and this is definitely the type of player you could consider a 3-down workhorse. He's had at least 1 reception in each game as being the starter. He's also peaked with a game at 5 receptions and has scored 5 rushing touchdowns over the last 4 contests. If you pick him up, you should be able to start him as early as this week. They face Cincinnati, who rank about middle of the pack at defending opposing fantasy running backs. The next running back we have is another player you could start this week. It's Salvon Ahmed of the Miami Dolphins. His ownership a bit higher in the low 40s, but at this point, he needs to be owned in all leagues. The reason I say that is because there is no denying he is the man when it comes to this backfield. While yes, his overall fantasy performance was a bit underwhelming this week against Denver, he did get 17 overall touches, 5 of which in the form of receptions, the highest value touch that we have possible. And while he didn't score a touchdown, if you look at the running backs behind him, no other rusher in this offense was able to eclipse 2 total touches. In turn, we know he has a stranglehold on the volume coming out of this offense. The offense really did struggle to move the ball at all against Denver, but they should have a much easier time against the New York Jets next week. New York Jets already rank in the top 10 at allowing fantasy points to the position, and just allowed Melvin Gordon to average 5.6 yards per carry and score on the ground twice against them this past week. The next running back we have is James White of the New England Patriots, a PPR monster for us all throughout the past few seasons, but really kind of slowed it down in this offense under Cam Newton. The big news, of course, is that Rex Burkhead, he went down with an ACL injury. Immediately, we saw the volume for James White go up. This is definitely a trend we can expect to continue because Rex Burkhead's involvement in that area of the game cannot be overstated. 3 receptions in week 9, 4 receptions including 2 receiving touchdowns in week 10, and another 2 receptions before going down with an injury this past week. That's the type of volume we can now expect to go over to James White's direction, and with the volume against Houston, White was able to produce 6 receptions for 64 yards. If you're in any sort of PPR or half PPR league, that volume is very valuable, and we're really not seeing any running backs across the entire league get that type of volume consistently. The next running back we have is Frank Gore, coming in at 19% ownership. I'm not going to lie to you and say that this is a running back that has a massive amount of upside, but considering LaMichael Pirine, the running back that was taking snaps ahead of him, is now down with an injury, the upside and potential of Frank Gore stepping in, getting a very high amount of volume in the run game and receiving game as well, it's definitely there. LaMichael Pirine is noted with having an ankle injury. He left in the third quarter and did not return, but at this point we're not sure if it is a high ankle sprain or not. A high ankle sprain would hold him out much longer, presumably through the fantasy playoffs and possibly end of the season, which would make Frank Gore a pretty solid spot start for teams desperate to fill that running back position. The next running back we have, and arguably I could understand ranking him higher on this list, is going to be Tevin Coleman of the San Francisco 49ers. The list of the players that are in this backfield for San Francisco that are on IR, it's just growing and growing. We have Raheem Mostert, Jeff Wilson Jr., and now JaMycal Hasty. Jerick McKinnon himself, he's also banged up, and we know with his health history, it wouldn't surprise anyone if he goes down as well. Don't get me wrong, Tevin Coleman's not the poster boy for health himself. He only played 2 games to start the season before going out for several weeks, came back, played in 1 game, and then has been out until where we are right now. As it stands though, Tevin Coleman is expected to come back this week, and with all of the running backs either out, banged up, or on IR, Tevin Coleman could be in a prime position to get a hefty amount of volume this week. The next running back we have is Carlos Hyde of the Seattle Seahawks. The reason he ranks so low is because Chris Carson is projected to return next week. If Chris Carson does return, I don't think Carlos Hyde does have starter level value, but we do know Chris Carson has dealt with injuries at 2 separate points this season. That's not to say that Carlos Hyde is any safer from an injury standpoint. Carlos Hyde himself has missed 5 of the past 7 contests, but in games where there is no Chris Carson, Carlos Hyde is the man for this backfield. In the past 2 games that he's played, he's averaged 17 touches per game, scored on the ground in each of those contests, and had consistent volume in the receiving game with 2 receptions and 3 receptions alike. That type of volume in production is very valuable, so consider him a handcuff for Chris Carson. And on the Seattle Seahawks offense, that is a very valuable handcuff role. We're moving over to wide receivers, and there are some really solid options. I understand that the ownership percentages, they are a bit higher than usual, but we really don't have any players in that bargain bin type area. Yes, you could go low for somebody like Bird on the New England Patriots, but that to me seems more like a 1-week wonder than anything we could start to trust consistently. A player who I do trust for the long term more is going to be a player like Michael Pittman out of Indianapolis. Currently, Michael Pittman is only owned in 24% of leagues, and he's now coming off of 2 very solid back-to-back performances. It doesn't seem as though he's hampered by injuries that have kept him out in 3 of 10 games this season, but he's definitely came into his own over the past 2 contests. In those 2 contests, he's combined for 189 total yards. This past weekend, he even scored a long touchdown. And heading into this week, he faces Tennessee once again, the same team that he just torched, for 7 receptions for over 100 receiving yards. It's also worth noting that he gets to play Houston 2 more times in weeks 13 and 15, and in week 16 when you see Pittsburgh in the fantasy championships, you may be scared away, but don't forget that Pittsburgh allows top 10 numbers when it comes to fantasy points allowed to the wide receiver position. We're moving over to the next player, another rookie. It's Jalen Reagor of the Philadelphia Eagles. He's currently owned in 22% of leagues, and I definitely think he has some better games ahead of him. Travis Fulgham, the previous leading receiver for this team before some other receivers were starting to get healthy, receivers like Alshon Jeffrey, Jalen Reagor, and Dallas Goedert. Fulgham, in the past 2 contests, he's been struggling. Meanwhile, Jalen Reagor from the receiver position has been basically the lone bright spot. Travis Fulgham converted his 7 targets into just 1 reception for 8 yards. 1 reception was the same stat line that he was able to post last week as well. Meanwhile, Jalen Reagor, he's caught 8 of his 12 targets over the past 2 contests, posting nearly 100 receiving yards. The Philadelphia Eagles offense, though, overall, it has been struggling. We have seen Carson Wentz and the Eagles fall into this pit earlier this season and pick themselves up out of it, so we shouldn't be completely blindsided if the Philadelphia Eagles do make a late season push. If that does happen, one of the main beneficiaries, a receiver who's already playing and performing very efficiently, he's going to have the most to gain in that situation, and like I said, none of us should be surprised if that actually happens. The next receiver we have is Curtis Samuel of the Carolina Panthers. I know his ownership percentage is extremely high at 65%. I usually try to stick to 60% or below, but considering he was 65, and I figured there could be a chance that he might might be out there coming off of a bad game last week, I figured might as well throw him in there just as a reminder to try to grab him off your waivers if at all possible. I did mention that he was coming off of a bad game in week 10, but keep in mind, this is a player who in PPR leagues has scored 20 plus points in 3 of the past 4 contests, so if there's any chance you can grab him out there, we would definitely recommend doing so. The next wide receiver we have to bring up is Lazard of the Green Bay Packers. I know this name won't be very popular, especially him not having a massive performance, but we have to understand this game was against the Indianapolis Colts, a really tough defensive matchup for wide receivers. So when looking for positive signs in Lazard's trending, we have to look a bit deeper. I'd suggest looking at the snaps. One thing to take note of is that Marquez Valdes-Scantling, a player who has been playing absolutely out of his mind, some of the best football of his career over the past 3 weeks. That player not only took a dip in production this past week, but he also saw a loss in opportunities. Meanwhile, Lazard, his first game back from injury, his opportunity share did increase, and this is definitely a trend we will continue to see in the coming weeks. We would suggest getting ahead of this and grabbing Lazard this week before he possibly has a big game, because with Aaron Rodgers in the mix for MVP candidate, you know those types of games could come any given week now. We have one final wide receiver for you this week, and I know it's not a fan favorite, but it's Breshad Perriman of the New York Jets coming in at 14% ownership. I'm not saying to add Perriman because he's coming off of a phenomenal game or anything. No, he did only have 2 receptions, but those receptions went for 54 yards, and he was able to score a touchdown. This now makes 3 total touchdowns in his past 2 contests, and overall in this matchup against the Chargers, the New York Jets offense really couldn't move the ball whatsoever, so Breshad Perriman was somewhat of a lone bright spot in this contest and definitely a player you could continue to roll the dice on for weeks to come. We aren't suggesting to start him as anything more than a spot start, of course, but if you are in some sort of desperate situation and end up having Perriman on your roster in week 15 when they play Seattle, that's definitely a matchup that has some upside along with it. Alright guys, we're moving over to tight end, and I'll apologize in advance, we don't have a lot of names for you. In fact, this is more of a shrunken down list from what we had last week. And last week, honestly, it wasn't great either. Like I said though, last week, I don't want to just throw names out there in a hat and just suggest you pick guys up that I really don't think have season-long value for you, or any players I don't think you can extract value from as we head into the playoffs and beyond. So unfortunately, this is the list that you're going to get this week, guys. The top of the list for probably the 4th week in a row, this is Dallas Goedert of the Philadelphia Eagles. This will be the last week, of course, that we're able to include him, because right now he's at 58% ownership. He will certainly be above that 60% threshold as soon as waivers clear on Wednesday, because Dallas Goedert, he had his coming out party since returning from injury. While 6 targets isn't all that much for the tight end position, that's a solid amount of volume, and he was able to convert his 6 targets into 5 receptions, 77 yards, and even caught a receiving touchdown. His 5 receptions, while not seeming all that high, was able to lead the team in that area. His 77 receiving yards was also a team high, and his targets, they did rank second. Like I said, the overall offense for Philadelphia has been struggling across the board. This is certainly a player who could also see improvement with improvement from the offense, but even in games in which Philly struggles, like this one, Dallas Goedert was able to find success. This is a player we see as trending up as opposed to trending down, who caught a lucky break, so the odds of anyone getting him off of the waivers after this week are going to be slim to none. The next tight end we have is Dalton Schultz of the Dallas Cowboys. This has been a player that has been basically forgotten by the fantasy community. As a result, we see his ownership at a mere 24%, but he really deserves to be owned in many more leagues than that. We're seeing less talented, less productive tight ends be on much more rosters, and it really doesn't make sense. Dalton Schultz, he's seeing the volume we would want out of a tight end. Over the past 3 contests, we're talking 21 total targets. That's an average of 7 targets per game. And while his ceiling hasn't been all that high with the lack of scoring that the Dallas Cowboys overall have been doing, he was able to finally reach the end zone this past week. This upcoming matchup against Washington, it's actually a pretty positive matchup for the tight end position as a whole. Not just because the Washington football team allows a ton of fantasy points to tight ends, but they're just very stingy against opposing running backs and wide receivers. In turn, that does usually funnel the offenses to utilize the tight end position more, so Dalton Schultz should be in line for a productive game once again this upcoming week. The final tight end we have is Jordan Reed of the San Francisco 49ers. I would rank him higher if there just wasn't so much risk surrounding his long-term value. Jordan Reed, we know as a player and an individual contributor, he's able to produce, but his time due to injury concerns, we know Reed is one of the most injury-prone tight ends in the entire league, as well as the potential and looming return of George Kittle. The overall combination just adds up to too much risk for valuing Jordan Reed as anything more than a short-term spot start. I will say that his final performance before the bye week, 6 targets, 5 receptions, 62 receiving yards, something tells me that's probably not going to be his best stat line he produces between now and the rest of the season. Just know overall that his time and days as a starter, they're going to be numbered. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. We really hoped you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.